How's it going, everybody? Sean from LUMIX Live here, and while we are not actually live this week, we wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about the exciting new firmware update that we have just announced last night for the S5 Mark II, S5 Mark II X, GH7, and G9 Mark II. So we're going to take a little bit of time today. I'm going to walk through the installation of firmware, so we're actually going to do a little bit of a process of this is how you install firmware, this is where you find it, these are the steps you want to take to make sure that you can get it on your camera. And then we're going to walk through on my S5 Mark II X all the new additions that you can find within this firmware and a quick little visual demonstration of what they do, how you can interact with them, and a little bit of commentary on how I think they're going to be really beneficial to pretty much anyone that's out there using any of these cameras. So with that, let's jump right into it with talking about how do you actually get these firmware files. So one of the first things that we always kind of talk about is being able to go online, download the firmware files, or use something like LUMIX Lab or LUMIX Sync if you're still using that program or that app to be able to download them. And first and foremost, if you are using one of the mobile apps, so Sync or Lab, connect your camera into it, log into, or just go into the app, and you should be prompted with a notice that says a new firmware is available for your camera. If you don't see that notification, you can typically click on the settings for the individual app itself. It's usually the little three, like what's usually called a hamburger icon. You can click on that and then look for firmware updates, and usually you can find it there. If you don't want to wait, since pushing firmware updates through the app sometimes can take a little bit longer than if you just go online right now and download it yourself, you would go to our website, which I will put a link on the screen right here, where you can actually then get the app downloaded, or not the app, the firmware file downloaded yourself. So where do you, once you're on the actual web page for the firmware files, you'll see we have this broken out into Micro Four Thirds cameras and lenses, as well as full frame system cameras and lenses as well. This, at the time of this being recorded, these firmware updates are not available on the public website yet, but this is where you're going to find them. You're going to see a little new icon with the current date. And again, this is going to be for the GH7, the G9 Mark II, as well as in the full frame line of cameras, the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark II X. So super easy. Once you go to this page, you're going to click on the link to download, follow the instructions that pop up. You're going to get a window that pops up in its own that then is going to give you, kind of description of what the firmware is, like what it includes. You're going to click on the download link, follow the little, agree to the terms that you're downloading the firmware file. And then what you're going to get is a .bin file, or if you're on Windows, you may download a .zip file. On Mac, it's going to give you a .bin file. That is the file that you will actually take. It does not need to be unzipped. It is literally .bin. You're then going to take that particular file and you're going to put it onto an SD card. Now, the important thing, and why I want to mention this, is a lot of times people will just drag and drop that file onto the memory card, whether it's on a Mac or a Windows computer, and then just pull the card out of the computer. Vast majority of the times when you run into a problem with downloading firmware is that the process of dragging and dropping doesn't always copy the file. It can depend on what your computer system settings are basically defaulted to. But you want to make sure that once that file has been drag and drop or copy and pasted onto the root of the folder, you then eject that memory card. Once that memory card has been ejected, you can then put it into your camera and then run the firmware update process manually. So with that, let's actually jump over to the camera, as I have this file already on an SD card, and we'll walk through the process of how to update it from there. All right, so here we are. We are looking through my S5 Mark II X. I have the memory card installed that has the new firmware file on it. And what you're going to do is quite simple on the modern cameras. You're going to click the menu button. You're going to go to the setup menu, which is the wrench icon. You're going to go into the subfolders, and you're going to go to the last option, that is the wrench with 3 dots. And then you're going to scroll down to firmware version. Once you click on firmware version, this is where it'll confirm to you what is the lens firmware version, what is the body firmware version. And if you have something like the MC21 adapter or a teleconverter attached, or the XLR2 or XLR1, you would have that information on this page as well. So for here, you're just going to press firmware update. The screen's going to prompt you, say please wait. It's reading through the card to find the data. And once you see that, you just click yes, and you're going to start the process for update. The important thing about this is that you want to leave the camera alone. You don't want to interact with the camera, don't press any buttons. Some firmware updates can take quite a long time, especially if you're coming from maybe like a much older version. So in this particular case, as you saw, my particular camera was on 1.3. I purposely found one of the cameras that I haven't updated to show you, what you would see. But once you start this process, again, make sure you don't touch the camera, don't play with the focus ring. Make sure you follow the instructions that are on the page about, making sure that the card has been formatted, all of those steps, and then just hang out. I said sometimes these firmware updates can take quite a while, especially if you're coming from an older version of the firmware, or if it's a major improvement or addition to features like this firmware update is. So it could take a little bit of time, but just be patient, and once it's ready to go, we'll come back and continue from there. All right, and we're back. The camera will automatically reboot after you do the firmware update, so just give it a second. You'll see that the power will go off, it'll come back on, and then you can check to make sure that your firmware is updated by pressing the menu set button, go back to that same firmware version location, hit OK, and then it'll tell you body firmware, lens firmware, in this case 2.2 for the S5 Mark IIX. I'll put the version numbers for the other cameras down on the bottom of the screen. So, what did this firmware update bring? Well, let's talk about it from a video sense first. So, as we had mentioned, if you've read the press release, there are a number of updates that I like to consider calling this the unification firmware. All of you have been asking since the launch of the GH7 and the launch of the S9 about when those features were going to be coming to your S5 Mark IIs, your S5 Mark IIX, as well as the G9 Mark II. And this is the update that brings the vast majority, if not all of them, to these cameras. Now, there are certain things that aren't available on the Micro Four Thirds cameras because of either sensor type, the ratio of the sensor, or communication protocols between the lenses, which we'll cover, and we'll make sure I call that out. But across the board, everything's pretty unified. So like I said, we're going to talk about video first. You can find the new updates by going into the video menu, which you can see here is with the camcorder icon. And when I scroll over, we're going to go down to the first image formats page. This is where you select your rec file format, as well as like your image area, as you can see on the screen. What is new here is the MP4 Lite, or the Open Gate Lite recording format. Everyone has been asking since it was released on the S9 when this is going to come to the S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX, and well, it's here. This option is going to be great for situations where you want to be able to have a lighter weight open gate file. Maybe you don't need the entire 6K resolution, but you want a 3840 wide image still. So for general 4K capture, or if you're someone who works in a mobile workflow, you want to be able to have a version of OpenGate that can be sent into your mobile device to then be edited for vertical, horizontal, you name it. Basically, that's what that system's for. So, as I said, as you look at this, when you change it into the MP4 Lite mode, you're going to see under Rec Quality, you have the option for the 3.8K OpenGate Lite, or MP4 Lite, that is 3840 by 2560 high. In a 3:2 ratio, and this is just like on the S9, this is a 30 frames per second mode. Now, if you're recording in PAL regions, it'll be a 25 frames per second mode. This is an option that can be recorded to both of the internal card slots. It can be recorded to an external SSD. It's ultra flexible, and again, it's giving you that full field of view, so you're going to get the full height and width of the sensor from a field of view perspective, but you're getting a lower resolution that's much more, transfer friendly and much more storage friendly. So that means it's still a 420 10-bit HEVC file. It's at 50 megabit per second instead of the higher bit rate that the normal open gate option records at. So a lot easier to work with, a lot less demanding on your mobile devices, and it's an MP4 specifically because MP4 has a much wider compatibility for iOS and Android devices across the board. So while the newest iOS and Android devices are fairly good at handling MOV files and relatively higher bit rates, making sure that across the board, your phone's going to be okay to handle these files is what this mode is about. So we're really excited that this has been added into the camera. Now, the next thing, because this kind of goes hand in hand with open gate capture, is frame markers. Now, again, we updated the frame marker functionality. This isn't necessarily a new thing. The S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX and all of the cameras have had frame markers for quite some time now. But finally, these cameras are getting the expanded frame marker functionality. So you'll find frame markers in these cameras by going to the custom menu, which is the gear icon, and then going into monitor, display, and in this case, video for page 1. You can then see frame marker, go into this option, and if you want to set it up before applying it, you just scroll down to set. Now this is where you can come in and say, well, which frame markers do I want shown? In this case, let's say I want to have a 16:9. I want to be able to have this one say as a red frame. Then for frame marker number 2, I want a 9:16 because I want to have my vertical version as well. But I want that one to stay blue. And then let's say for frame marker number 3, I want this to be CinemaScope. So let's do 239:1. So we'll have 239:1, and then let's change this color to say green, something pretty different from the others. Now all 3 of those frame markers are set up and kind of ready to go. The cool thing is you still have frame mask functionality. So I can click into here and I can say, hey, I want to have this with about a 50%, kind of frame mask for all the non-covered areas with these guides. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you turn on live view frame adjustment. Live view frame adjustment is what allows me to tap on those frames when they are visible on the screen so that I can then reposition and resize them on the go and not have to menu dive to find them. So once I have all of that set up, I literally just come out, go to frame marker, click on, and then now when I exit the menu, you see I have all 3 of them up and I have their 3 different colors. Now again, the cool thing with this is that being able to actually kind of go in and change these frame markers means that I can reposition them. So because I have this attached with my HDMI out on this particular setup, I'm going to come in and I'm going to change the position and size of this. So what's cool is you can see that in the top right, if I move my face camera, you can see on the top right that for the 239:1 aspect ratio, I can come in and I can tap on that box and I can resize it. So I can maximize the width. I can use the center box and I can slide it up and down. And you can kind of see it in this particular shot, but in the top, and actually let me move one of these so that we can actually see it a little bit better. So I'm going to resize my 16:9 so it's much smaller. I can tap the Q menu button and then slide through the different masks that I want to choose. But as I move this up and down, you can see that frame masking that shows up or hides depending on what is being covered by the multiple frame markers. So because I have 3 of them up, I can move this around and say like, hey, I want this to be a little bit lower. So my 16:9 that's in the middle is still able to have some separate coverage of it. So as I move this, you see that the area that's overlapped with these frame markers is not covered in the overlay. The areas that aren't, which are areas that you wouldn't be using, are still visible. They're basically shaded out with the mode that I've got selected. But again, this whole thing allows me to just kind of cycle through these, reposition. If I know like, hey, I'm going to want my 9:16, but I'm going to want to slide this one up because I want to make sure I have enough headroom based on my 16:9, I have all of that flexibility now. So I know I can have this one maybe go all the way down so I can keep myself kind of framed right. Or maybe I want this one all the way up so I know that I'm giving myself that headroom. I have that the 9:16, and then my CinemaScope say I know I'm going to want to punch in on this one dead center. There you go. That gives me all of that flexibility to be able to change these different aspect ratios and get them set up how I want them for my particular shoot. Now, instead of having to menu dive to find all of these things, the nice thing is that you can, just like many other custom functions, press and hold on one of the like directional pads or one of the function buttons, and I can assign this to a toggle for on and off. So I can scroll down to the frame marker option here, go in, and then I can program either frame marker, so this will toggle them on and off, or I can toggle a change size and position. So this gives me a couple different ways to interact with frame markers. So right now I just set it to toggle on and off, so now I can just press it, have them up if I want it, press it again, they're gone, and I have a much cleaner display. So frame markers are a really nice addition with this setup. You don't have to just use them in OpenGate. You can use them in any of the aspect ratios that you would normally be recording in. And this is a feature, both of these are features that are found in both the Micro Four Thirds cameras as well as the full frame cameras. Now, one thing to note, if you were on a GH7 or a G9 Mark II, your resolution numbers are going to be a little different in the vertical side. Now, that is strictly down just because of the aspect ratio of the sensors. In full frame, it's a 3:2 ratio, and it is a fixed 3840 wide for resolution. So that means that you get a little bit more squat in that 3:2 ratio. In Micro Four Thirds, because it's a 4:3 ratio, you get a little bit more squared ratio, so you get a little bit taller of a resolution. It's only by about 260-ish or 230-ish pixel lines vertically, but in some cases that can be a really big benefit if you're on Micro Four Thirds versus the full frame side of cameras. Now, the last kind of major thing that I want to talk about, because there are other updates like making sure that there's compatibility for the new 18-40 that just gives you a little notice that says, hey, you got to rotate the lens if you want to use this lens on this camera, is the addition of crop zoom and hybrid zoom. So crop zoom and hybrid zoom were introduced on the S9. And again, these are features that now that we're going to have them on the S5 Mark II, or now that we have them on the S5 Mark II, the Mark IIX, they really can kind of like shine depending on the lenses that you're going to use. Now, we talked about hybrid zoom and crop zoom in more detail on a video a couple of months ago, and I'll link to that right here on a card so you can take a look at a little bit more in-depth real-world demonstration of it. But ultimately, what this is going to do is this is going to allow you, whether you're in photo or video mode, to pair the mechanical zoom of a lens that's on the L-mount Alliance, so that's a Leica, Sigma, or Panasonic lens, or one of the lenses from other manufacturers as they come out, and it's going to allow you to be able to actually come in and adjust the focal length, or the visible field of view of the lens that you're using based on a couple of different factors. So with hybrid zoom, which is a feature exclusive to the S series at this point. Now, there, as I mentioned earlier on, there are a couple things that are different between full frame and Micro Four Thirds. Hybrid zoom is a full frame feature at this point. It requires the communication of focal length from the lens to the camera, and that's something that's part of the communication protocols with the L mount, that not so much on the Micro Four Thirds mount. But when you're using this, you have that option again to go into set and change various different effects. Again, I talk about these in the other video, and again, I will have that linked in the description and as a card up on the screen here. But the big things to kind of recognize here is, what is your minimum image size that you want to be able to work with? Is this something that you're going to use for, say, social media delivery, and you don't really need, a 24 megapixel image? You're fine with something that's, 2.5 megapixel. Or do you want to make sure that you've got something, around 6 megapixel to work, or even up to 12? Now, in the menu description here, it's telling me that, hey, if I want to keep to 12 megapixel, it's going to be a 1.4 crop is what can be added to the lens that I'm using. A small image gets me 2x, and an extra small image is what gets me around 3 to 3.2 times magnification. And I say around that because it's going to depend on what aspect ratio you've got the camera set up to. So if I leave this in small, and then I come in and I say, do I want to set the image recording size? This means that I can force the camera to say, hey, if I selected XS, keep it at XS. Usually I leave that off. But once I have the basics set up here, I can then go back and turn hybrid zoom on. This will say that it's going to change the zoom settings. And again, these are things that are going to affect the JPEG image. This is not going to affect the raw image. Your raw image is going to stay 24 megapixels with the optical field of view. The only thing that's going to change is what your JPEG output looks like as far as the resolution goes. So if we look at it here, I am on the 20 to 60 millimeter kit lens that we ship with the S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX. And you'll see that because I have this set for XS, as I make this zoom, I can go well beyond 60 and bring this all the way into 187 millimeter. So now I've got something that gives me a ton more reach all in one setup. And if I grab an image with this setup here and I take this shot, what's cool is that if I shoot in RAW plus JPEG, so right now this was just a JPEG, but if I come in and change my settings to capture RAW, so we'll do this actually just as a RAW file, so that you see it a little bit clearer. So we set this up as RAW. You notice that option's gone. If I come in and I say RAW plus fine, you see that option comes back. Now, if I'm using two memory cards and I have my RAW files on one side and my JPEGs on another, I can set my camera up, come down into the settings, go up to memory card. We'll do double card slot function. I'm going to change this to allocation recording. And let's have my JPEG files go on to card number 2. So now that that's all set up, I can do this again. I can take a shot. So we'll take one image. And then now when I go to playback, you'll see here, this is the JPEG. So this is that full XS JPEG that I captured. But if I want to change my cards and I go to card slot 1, which is going to have my RAW file on it, you notice that RAW file is showing me a grayed out area with a visible crop in the middle of the frame. That gives me an indication that, hey, this RAW file has the full resolution and the full field of view of the optic lens, but this is the flagging that you're going to see when you bring this RAW file into something like Lightroom or Capture One or any program that reads what we're doing settings-wise. So that crop will automatically apply when you bring it into your RAW editing software, while you still know that you have that full field of view available for editing that photo later should you want to change the crop at a later time. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about before I just mention the ultimate last piece, which really isn't about the camera itself, is the crop zoom functionality. So we're going to go into video for this one actually, and I'm going to change my S5 Mark IIX into the video mode here. And with the crop zoom functionality, there's a little bit of difference as to how this works. Crop zoom, when you go into the settings, you're going to have a separate photo and video option for these, so you can independently control them one or the other. But what crop zoom does is give you the ability to come in and say, hey, I want to apply up to a certain perspective of a crop onto the image through digital means, but I want to have it limited based on the resolution that I'm capturing, in this case in video. So it's all going to depend on what your video resolution settings are. So in this case, I have the camera set up in OpenGate Lite or MP4 Lite. That means that when I'm going to capture this, I'm only ever going to be able to crop in as far as 3.8 megapixel or 3.8K in a 3:2 aspect ratio. So what does that actually look like? Well, if we come in and I turn this on, you're going to see that I can press up on the directional pad and I can crop in a very fast manner, or I can press right and left in this particular case. And I'm using the directional pad on this. This basically just does a center cut crop of the frame based on the resolution that you have the camera set up in. So that means if I want to maximize my crop here, I can say, let's put this into regular MP4 and let's bring this all the way down into a full HD 30 frames per second option. And we're going to come down and we're going to go back into crop zoom. And now what you'll see is look at how much further I can punch this in. So I can make this, while my lens is at 20 millimeters still, I can now be able to crop in this image to be 62 millimeter. If I go all the way in to my 60 millimeter, it means I can bring it to 187 millimeter. Now, the benefit with this, with crop zoom, is that in those very specific situations where you need to give yourself just a little bit more reach, but you don't want to go to a point where you have to worry about, well, am I recording enough resolution? Or if I know my project's in 4K, I can record in 4K, but I don't necessarily need the full field of view. You can on the fly go in and use this mode and just change the focal length. You can either apply a normalized magnification to it. So I can say, hey, I always want to apply, a 2x magnification on this lens. Gives you a little bit more reach, but it makes sure that it stays within the resolution for the video that you're capturing. So those are the major things that were added in with this firmware update. There's a bunch of other things that are tied to various security enhancements and things that are involved for things like RTMP and RTSP that are a little more regional. So we're not really going to talk about them at this point. You can read the release notes of the firmware update on the website when you download the file. But the last thing that I want to talk about is the addition for LUMIX Lab. So LUMIX Lab, we had mentioned a little while ago that this is kind of basically like the new app to use. So if you've been using LUMIX Sync, and we hear you, we've heard you for a little while now, about how you want to be able to take things like being able to remote control your camera. You want to be able to use the Bluetooth functionality. You want to have the basic full feature set that LUMIX Sync has, but within the new app that utilizes the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, the much faster connection methodology, and just in general, the much more robust nature of the LUMIX Lab app. You finally have that with this update. So once you do the update on your cameras, just make sure you go to the App Store, iOS or Android app stores, and update your LUMIX Lab app. That is going to make sure that you have the compatibility to do all of the functionality that you need on the modern cameras. The one function that is still not really available on LUMIX Lab at this time is processing and editing RAW files in the app natively. If you want to still work with RAW files and use the better connection methodology and everything that the LUMIX Lab app brings, you can 100% still transfer your RAW files over. The one thing that's just different is that the editor that's built into LUMIX Lab at this time just doesn't support the RAW files. So things like Snapseed or Lightroom Mobile, or if you're on iOS, I think there's Capture One Mobile, you have the ability to still edit your RAW files through the mobile apps. It's just not going to be done through LUMIX Lab. All right, so the absolute last thing that I want to talk about is the improvements that have been made to the autofocusing system. So just like what we launched with the GH7, where we added the train and airplane detection modes, and then firmware added to the S9, we're now unifying that system as well. So cameras like the S5 Mark II, the Mark IIX, and the G9 Mark II are now receiving the full flexibility of our subject detection modes and the object recognition within these new cameras. So real brief overview of this. If I go into the menu and I look at subject or detecting subjects, you'll see that we have human and we have the target part here. So face and eye, and then face, eye, and body. But now under type of subject, you'll see we have human, animal, car, motorcycle. Those are the ones that have been there. But now the addition of train and airplane, as well as the improvements for things like motorcycle, where now I can come in and I can target either the entire subject, which is how it used to be, versus now saying helmet priority, where it will prioritize the rider's helmet. These are big improvements as far as subject detection goes, and depending on how you want to access them, if I click into the autofocus selector on the back, so that's the AF mode option, I can press up on the directional pad to turn on subject detection, and then I can press display on the back and then cycle through these instead of having to go through the menus. So lots of big improvements here when it comes to autofocus, as well with everything else that we've added in with this firmware. So with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in, even though we weren't live today. Hopefully you enjoyed the kind of brief overview of the new firmware update that we released for the S5 Mark II, S5 Mark II-X, G9 Mark II, and GH7. And hopefully you can take advantage of a lot of the new features that we have unified across our line. We will be live next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I already have everything kind of set up for that particular live stream. And I can guarantee that I won't have a conflict that keeps me from being able to do the live streams. So make sure to tune in then. If you have questions or topics that you want us to cover, make sure to drop them in the comment section below, so we can collect those and kind of go through and, kind of see what we want to create in the future with these streams. But also sound off in the chat which of these features you think is probably, your favorite, or which one you think is your favorite or even most useful. Are there things that you want to see us improve on or try to come out with in the future firmware wise? Let us know in the chat. That kind of stuff helps us pass information on to our engineering team. It helps us understand what you want to see in these products in the future. And honestly, that's where the vast majority of these updates have come from, is what you, the users, have actually been telling us. So with that, everybody, thank you so much again. I appreciate each and every one of you who tune in and watch these live streams, or in this case, this recorded broadcast. And I look forward to seeing you all next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time here on LUMIX Live. Later.